All right, welcome again. We are in week 2 of our study of the book of Daniel. We started this last Wednesday night and went through chapter 1, and we're gonna go into chapter 2 today. But let me just back up just for a moment and kind of catch you up to speed. We do have some folks who weren't here with us last week, but we started talking about Daniel and this character who has really kind of layers to his story, and we kind of broke Daniel down into some different parts where we talk about his character development early on, and that's where we're in right now. Is still talking about the development of his character and the character of his three friends, who we commonly call Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, although they had Hebrew names. So those weren't their actual names. We talked about that last week as well. And then we went through some historical information about when this was written and the conditions, and talked about the condition of Babylonian captivity, that Daniel is taken captive along with many other young people in the southern kingdom of Judah. They were taken captive by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians being ruled by this king who we're going to deal with again tonight, called Nebuchadnezzar. And in chapter 1, we find that story where the king requires that all the captives eat a certain type of food and participate in a regimen that will supposedly make them brighter and stronger and healthier and better than all the others, and bolster them in such a way that they're going to be propelled and pushed to be leaders in the kingdom. And the goal really is to take all of their upbringing and all of their past experience away from them and make them truly and completely Babylonian. That's the goal that Nebuchadnezzar has. And so Daniel falls into this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they all come into this, and they're being groomed, if you will, or trying to be. The king is trying to groom them so that they become perfect Babylonian citizens and obey and follow and absorb the culture and live the culture and become the culture of Babylon and the religion and everything you can imagine. In Daniel, we read that scripture where Daniel purposed in his heart that he wasn't going to do that he was not going to allow himself to become that. He was going to keep who he was. He was going to keep true to who he is and who he was. And so that determination to set yourself apart, to be sanctified, and to live that kind of life is one that we looked at, and the miracle that resulted in that God favored him and propelled him in the king's service. And the ideas that we took away from that last week really are just kind of simple, that God can use us anywhere. That God can use us He can use any type of situation. That God can take anything that we may think is awful and bad and not going to help us, but God can take that, and even in those circumstances, He can use that to propel us and move us forward, and ultimately to move His kingdom forward. So we're going to see more examples of that tonight as we look at chapter 2. So we're going to just start reading, and we're going to take this pretty much verse by verse, and there are some important lessons, I think, that we really can learn from chapter 2. Now, you remember last week we talked about this idea of divination, and in Mesopotamian culture, the divination typically involved some type of a dream or a vision or an appearance of something to someone, and that was believed to be a communication from the gods. Dreams especially, night dreams while they were sleeping, were taken very seriously. What does this mean? What does this mean for my life? What does this mean for the kingdom? What does this mean for my future? And, oftentimes a dream was just a dream. They were just dreaming about something, and the king or whoever the high official was would call in the people who were supposed to be able to explain and expound upon the dream, and they would say, tell us what the dream was, and say, well, I dreamed I was being chased by a bear in the woods, and you know, we came to a creek, and there were two squirrels sitting over here fishing, and you know the kind of dreams you have, right? And so the diviner would say, okay, well, this means that this is going to happen or that's going to happen, and they would just kind of really make up some story about what this dream meant. So it involved the dream. It also involved this diviner, this person who dealt in the understanding or was supposed to have understood dreams and to interpret the communication that was believed to come from the gods. And there were many gods in Babylonian culture, gods for lots of different things. And so as we go into chapter 2, it's important that we understand that this culture really took seriously what a person's dreams meant, especially if that person was important. It was believed that that was the way that the gods were trying to speak to and through that person. And so the interpretation of dreams and the dreams themselves became very important. We're going to see tonight that understanding of a dream takes a little bit of a twist tonight with Nebuchadnezzar and how he pursues an understanding of a dream. So in Daniel chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, let's just look at it together. I'm reading from the New Living Translation, just a little bit clearer on some of the language and things. And normally I read from New King James, but this is New Living that I'm using for tonight, and probably will throughout the study. In chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "One night during the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had such disturbing dreams that he couldn't sleep. He called in his magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers, and he demanded that they should tell him what he had dreamed." There's the twist. He demanded that they should tell him what he had dreamed. Normally, the king or the official who had the dream would call them in and say, "This is what I dreamed, now you tell me what it means." Tonight, Nebuchadnezzar decides, this is so disturbing that I'm going to make them tell me what the dream is and tell me what it means. As they stood before the king, he said, "I have had a dream that deeply troubles me, and I must know what it means." The astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, "Long live the king. Tell us the dream, and we will tell you what it means." That was the normal course. You tell us what the dream was, we'll tell you what you saw and why you saw it. But the king said to the astrologers, "I'm serious about this. If you don't tell me what my dream was and what it means, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. But if you tell me what I dreamed and what the dream means, I will give you many wonderful gifts and honors. Just tell me the dream and what it means." Nebuchadnezzar demands these two things. Tell me the dream and tell me what it means. And they're arguing with him, naturally. And they said again, "Please, your majesty, tell us the dream and we'll tell you what it means." And the king replied, "I know what you're doing. You're stalling for time because you know I'm serious when I say if you don't tell me the dream, you're doomed. So you have conspired to tell me lies, hoping that I'll change my mind. But tell me the dream, and then I'll know that you can tell me what it means." This argument back and forth between the astrologers, the sorcerers, those who practice divination, and Nebuchadnezzar. This is where we find this first part. We find this part that we call a madman's proclamation. You can read this and have a pretty good idea that Nebuchadnezzar was not just disturbed by his dream. He was just a man who was probably disturbed by a lot of things. A man who lived on edge, a man who had a lot of insecurities, a man who was powerful and regarded in his culture and his day as being great, and people looked up to him, and people obeyed him because he was the king, and there were consequences for not obeying. But he was a man, even though he was a leader, he was a man who was deeply insecure, a man who was on edge about his kingdom and his power, afraid that any little thing might knock him off course and take that power away. And so he now demands, as not only a show of his authority, but also a demonstration of a deeper insecurity, he demands of these people who are brought before him, you tell me what's going on, because I can't figure this out. He's deeply troubled. He's deeply disturbed. And so he says, if you don't do this, if you can't tell me, then I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill everyone in your household. Verse 10, the astrologers replied to the king, no one on earth can tell the king his dream. No one on earth. You got that right. That was their job. And now they're admitting to the king, we can't do this. We can't do what you're asking us to do. There's no one who can read your mind. No one on earth can tell the king his dream. And no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked such a thing of any magician, enchanter, or astrologer. The king's demand is impossible. No one except the gods can tell your dream. Notice what they say next. And they do not live here among people. No one could do this except the gods. And the gods that we serve in Babylon, they don't even live here. Everything about Babylonian culture, that belief system and structure that teaches that there are many gods, and gods for this and a god for that, and a god that handles this part of life, and a God that handles that part of the universe. Here are the people who ought to know, the people who are supposed to be in tune with those gods, saying, we can't do this. We don't have that kind of ability. We don't have that kind of authority given to us. Our religion is hollow. It doesn't have any power. There's no depth to it. There's no hope to it. There's no substance to it. The gods that we serve and that we talk about and we build idols to and that we fall down and worship and all these things, they don't even live here. It was a bold admission in front of the king of how powerless the religion was. The king was furious, verse 12, when he heard this, and he ordered that all the wise men of Babylon be executed. And here's that insecurity, this extreme that he takes it to. So these astrologers and sorcerers that have been brought in front of him, they can't say what's going on. So he says, we're going to kill them all. Every one of them. The ones that are here, the ones that aren't here, the ones that we called into the king's court, the ones that haven't been called into the king's court, we're going to round them all up and we're going to execute them. And because of the king's decree, he put forth a royal order. Men were sent to find and kill Daniel and his friends and all the others who were compelled into this line of work or had come into this line of work. So this proclamation goes out. All these sorcerers, astrologers, dream readers, they're all going to die. Now, what do you think Nebuchadnezzar was going to do then? You know, if this is how he relies on hearing from his gods and he's going to kill them all just because a few of them can't figure this out, what was he expecting that was going to happen next? How was he going to have that? How was he going to have that connection to his gods then? You see, this is a place where we look at a man's argument, we look at a culture's argument for a little God here and a little God there and a piece of God here, and bringing it all together to try to form your own idea of what God is, and it crumbles and it falls apart. That's what happens to people when we start to look for divine connections where they aren't, and we start to look for divine connections where there is no truth and there is no grounding to God's word. Everything about that argument begins to fall apart, and we see that very clearly in this story. But then we look We move from this proclamation of this king, of a madman, and we look at a saved man's confidence. Beginning in verse 14. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, came to kill them, Daniel handled the situation with wisdom and discretion. Now, I don't know how he did that. Here's a man who comes to the house, knocks on the door, or busts the door down, I don't know, with the complete and total intention, because he's been commanded by the king, to kill the occupants of the house. And Daniel stands up and says, wait a minute, don't do it. With wisdom and discretion, he handled it. He asked Arioch, why has the king issued such a harsh decree? So Arioch told him all that had happened, and Daniel went at once to see the king and requested more time to tell the king what the dream meant. Now you understand, we talked about the favor of God on Daniel's life last week, and you understand how heavy that is, or that was last week in that testing period where Daniel and his friends ate their choice food rather than the king's diet, and how God used that to propel them. And here we see it again. This man has come to Daniel's house to kill him. And instead of killing him, he has a conversation with Daniel. Daniel is able to speak in such a way that they have a conversation. And at the end of that conversation, Daniel, because of the favor of God infused into his life, now is able to say to this man who's come to kill him, let's go. We're going to the king. And we're going to talk to the king about this, and we're going to figure this out. Daniel went from being not in charge, or being potentially a victim in this situation, to taking charge and taking control of it in a hurry. He goes to the king. Then Daniel went at once to the king and requested more time to tell the king what the dream meant, and he was granted that time. He was given that opportunity to have just a little bit more time. And we know that because in verse 17 it says he went home, he left the king, went home, and told his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what had happened. And he urged them to ask the God of heaven to show them his mercy by telling them the secret, so that they would not be executed along with the other wise men of Babylon. So they prayed. He goes home. Daniel has the confidence that God will enable him to understand. Now, up until this point, we don't read anywhere where Daniel says, I know what this means. I've got it all figured. God's already revealed it to me. We don't see that anywhere. We don't read anywhere that Daniel says, I know this is going to work out. I know that God's already given me the answer. He doesn't know what the dream is. He doesn't know what the interpretation of the dream is, but yet he's a man who's acting as if he does know. He doesn't know, but yet he knows. He doesn't know the dream. He doesn't know the interpretation, but he does know his God. And he does know the Lord, and he does know that the favor of the Lord is resting on his life. And that's one of the two things that's at work here. It's the favor of God. The king grants him more time. The servant of the king doesn't kill him right away. The favor of God is working in his life. It's granting him time. It's granting him opportunity. And that's what the favor of God does in the life of a believer. When we walk in the favor of God, and when the favor of God is upon us, we walk in opportunities that we might not otherwise have. We walk into situations that are bleak and grim and seem like they're very tough. And God gives us an advantage over the circumstance and the situation. That's walking in the favor of God. And that's what Daniel does. He walks in the favor of God, but that didn't just happen in his life. It didn't just happen because out of luck or by chance. It happened because of that decision that Daniel made back in chapter 1, where we read that he determined in his heart that he was going to live different. He determined in his heart that the course of his life wasn't going to be the course of life that everybody else was going to take. He determined that his life was going to be sold out to God, and that if it meant that even there were some difficult days ahead, that's what it meant. If it meant that he would be singled out and he would be tested more severely, then that's what it meant. If it meant that maybe even at the end of the testing that it didn't turn out the way that he thought that it would, and there would be some consequence to that, then that's what it meant. But he determined in his heart, I'm going to do this thing God's way. I'm going to live the way that God wants me to live. So the favor of God was at work in his life, and that favor comes out of the decision that Daniel made, that he was going to follow God's way. But the second thing that's at work there is faith. We see this infusion of faith into the story that Daniel, again, he doesn't know what's going to happen. He doesn't know for sure how this is going to play out, but yet he knows at the same time, he's just got this sense, this understanding, and it's his faith at work that shows him that it's going to be okay. He lives out for us, Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, that faith is the substance of things that we hope for. It's the evidence of things that we can't see. He couldn't see it. He didn't have all the answers given to him immediately, but he knew that God was with him and that God would be with him. So he goes back to his house. He goes to the dwelling of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he asked them to pray. He says, "You need to pray with me. You need to pray for me. You need to go before our God, and you need to talk to him about this situation and ask him to show me, to give me mercy, and tell me what this means, so that we can all be saved and we can all have more days ahead of us, because if this doesn't work out this way, then they're all going to die." So it's confidence and faith that's backed by prayer in this prayer covering, and it just is a good reminder to all of us that not only do we need to pray personally, but we need a prayer covering. We need people in our lives who will pray for us. People in our lives who we can share everything with and know that they're going to hold that close and that they're going to pray. You don't need people in your life that you tell them something and they go and tell everybody else. Nobody needs that. You need people in your life, though, who you can tell them something and they'll go and talk to God about it. A prayer covering. People in your life, and that group, it probably isn't going to work out to have a big group of people like that. It's a close group. It's a group that's limited in number. I've got prayer partners, and I won't tell you their names, and most of you would know their names, but here we go again. I've got prayer partners that every couple of weeks I send them things that are happening in my life and our family's life, and things that we're dealing with, things that we're struggling with. And they pray for me, and I know they do. And we don't get together and have conversations about those things. There's no need for that. I tell them what I need to tell them, and they pray for me, and they let me know that they're praying for me. And sometimes they'll ask, how's this going or how's that going? But I know that I can trust them. And you need people in your life like that too. People in your life that will get into the trenches with you and pray. You say, well, you need those people in your life because you're in the ministry. No, it's not about that. I need those people in my life because I'm human. And because I need people that I can call upon to pray for me. I need people that I can be real with, and you do too. It's one of the traps of the enemy to isolate us and say, well, you can't tell people that. They would think differently of you, or they would think They would think a certain way about you. And the enemy comes to us and says, you can't get real with people. You can't get vulnerable with people. You can't tell people everything that's going on in your life. That's one of his tricks. He comes to us and he says, go ahead and tell some things, but hold this back. Don't tell it. Don't expose it. And before you know it, that thing that you've not said, that thing that you've not said out loud, that thing that you've held close, becomes the thing that becomes your demise. It becomes the thing that gets bigger in your life. And the bigger it gets and the less you want to talk about it, the harder it gets to get out of that thing. And before you know it, it's caused a bigger thing or another set of things in your life. That's why we need each other. That's why we need the prayers of one another. That's why we need prayer partners. That's why you need to be somebody else's prayer partner. You need to be that for someone else. And Daniel goes back to his friends and says, we've got to pray about this. We've really got to. Now, this was an emergency thing, but I have a feeling that Daniel had been to them and they'd come to Daniel before and they'd shared prayer needs and they'd shared parts of their lives before because they were friends. But Daniel says, we got to pray about this. And, you know, it wasn't just all about faith. There had to be some prayer to it. You know, there's some theology out there that says, you know, all you need is faith. You know, you just faith, proclaim it, and claim it, and talk about it as if it was, and, you know, just name it and I understand that to a point. There's some things that we have to do when we have faith, but there needs to be some prayer to go with it too. James chapter 5 talks about the prayer of faith. It's not just all about faith, it's prayer and faith together, the two things that have to work together. And so Daniel says, you all need to pray. And they did, and that night in verse 19, it says, that night the secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision. They prayed, Daniel trusted, and God honored the prayer. That night the secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And then Daniel praised the God of heaven. And he said, praise the name of the Lord forever and ever, for he has all wisdom and power. He controls the course of world events. He removes kings, and he sets up other kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the scholars. He reveals the deep and mysterious things and knows what lies hidden in darkness, though he is surrounded by light. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors, for you have given me wisdom and strength. You have told me what we ask of you and revealed to us what the king demanded. God moved and answered the prayer. Simple as that. And Daniel enters into this psalm of praise, this song of praise that he enters into. Now, you look at the text of Daniel, these verses here in verses 21 or 20 through 23 are quite different from what you see everywhere else. It's Daniel's way of rejoicing in the Lord for what he's done. He knows that God has come through. And it's really modeled after what Daniel had learned in other from like the Psalms of David and others. He had learned this way of rejoicing and praising the Lord. And so he enters into that when he knows that God has answered his prayer. Then we get to the next day. It says that Daniel went to see Arioch, whom the king had ordered to execute the wise men of Babylon. Daniel said to him, don't kill the wise men. Take me to the king, and I will tell him the meaning of his dream. And we begin here to see this divine interpretation. This proclamation has come from a madman. Daniel has expressed his confidence, and now we see a divine interpretation. Arioch arose quickly, verse 25, and took Daniel to the king and said, I have found one of the captives from Judah who will tell the king the meaning of his dream. Now, I think it's interesting that the servant says, I found one of the captives from Judah. He didn't come along and say, hey, I got somebody that can tell you what's happening now. I found somebody that can do this. He's very specific about it. He says, I found one of the captives from Judah. Now, what was happening there? What was at work there with that statement? Was he just trying to be super clear in his communication? Maybe. Was he trying to cast doubt on Daniel's abilities? Maybe, by saying he's from Judah. I don't know if he's going to figure this out or not. Maybe he was. Was he trying to elevate Daniel in some way and say, well, this guy's different? Maybe because he's a captive and because there's maybe more at stake for him. Maybe that could be an answer. I think it, though, was, again, another example of the favor of God. That God got in the mouth of Arioch and said, this man is from Judah. God is about to elevate his people in the eyes of a pagan king. He's about to elevate the people of Israel right in the land of a nasty king. And he gets in the mouth of Arioch and said, I've got somebody. He's a captive. He came from Judah. And he says he can tell you the meaning of the dream. It's a small detail, but it's important. And so Daniel goes before the king. And the king said to Daniel, verse 26, is this true? Can you tell me what my dream was and what it means? And Daniel replies, there are no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or fortune tellers who can reveal the king's secret. It's not looking good so far for Daniel. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. But there is a God in heaven. Now contrast this. You've got Daniel who utters the words, there is a God in heaven. You've got Babylonian culture who says there's many gods. You've got Daniel who says there's a God in heaven who can do this. He's talking about a God that's able. You've got Babylonian gods who are unable. They have no power. They're weak. You've got Daniel who's saying that there's God who dwells in heaven. You've got the Babylonian sorcerers and magicians saying, we've got these gods, but they're not with us. We're not really sure where they are. But Daniel says, I know where this God is. He's a God that's in heaven. For there is a God in heaven. There's a God in heaven. Now, what is it in your life to which you need to answer with this phrase, there's a God in heaven? What is it that maybe you're facing that you need to respond this way? There is a God in heaven. There's a God who's able. There's a God who's going to come through. It was a bold witness in the face of this pagan king. It was a God-enabled witness in a moment that was critical where God enabled Daniel to speak the truth about who God was. It was confrontational in that moment. It was confrontational to the king and to everything that the king and the kingdom represent, but yet it was missional at the same time. Daniel was careful with his words by saying there's a God in heaven. He knew that Nebuchadnezzar understood or related to many gods. He says there's a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the future. This now becomes prophetic. It's a prophetic vision. It's a prophetic understanding that Daniel has. In verse 29, it says, while your majesty was sleeping, you dreamed about coming events. He who reveals secrets has shown you what is going to happen. And it is not because I'm wiser than anyone else that I know the secret of your dream, but because God wants you to understand what was in your heart. It's not because I'm wiser that I can tell you this. It's not because I have some inside track. The reason why you had this dream, the reason why I'm standing here in front of you to tell you the meaning of this dream is because God's trying to show you, king, what's in your heart. God is reaching out to you. God is trying to get your attention. Now he says this is what's going to happen in the future. And we have to understand, and we just finished the Revelation study a few weeks ago, but we have to understand that in prophecy, so many times we get caught up in prophecy. Lord, show me what's going to happen. Show me the what of prophecy. But God's intention in prophecy is not to show you what, it's to show you who. It's to show you who you are. It's to show you who He is and what He's going to do. His intention is not to show you all the steps and all the details. His intention is to show you who you are and what you need to do in relation to who He is. And so in verse 31, it begins a series of prophetic statements. Daniel says, in your vision, your majesty, notice he's respectful. He never once veers away from having respect for Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Daniel knows he's a pagan king. He knows that he serves pagan gods. He knows all of that, but he doesn't stoop to a level of saying that I can't be respectful. In your vision, your majesty, you saw standing before you a huge, shining statue of a man, and it was a frightening sight. The head of the statue was made of fine gold. Its chest and arms were silver. Its belly and thighs were bronze. Its legs were iron, and its feet were a combination of iron and baked clay. As you watched, a rock was cut from a mountain, but not by human hands. It struck the feet of iron and clay, smashing them to bits, and the whole statue was crushed into small pieces of iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold. Then the wind blew them away without a trace, like chaff on the threshing floor, but the rock that knocked the statue down became a great mountain that covered the whole earth. And he says in verse 36, that was the dream. That's what you had happening in your head. But now we'll tell you what it means. Your Majesty, again, proper respect. You are the greatest of kings. The God of heaven has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and honor. He has made you to rule over all the inhabited world, and has put even the wild animals and birds under your control. You are the head of gold. But after your kingdom comes to an end, another kingdom, inferior to yours, will rise and take your place. After that kingdom has fallen, yet a third kingdom, represented by bronze, will rise to rule the world. And following that kingdom, there will be a fourth one as strong as iron. The kingdom will smash and crush all previous empires, just as iron smashes and crushes everything it strikes. The feet and toes you saw were a combination of iron and baked clay, showing that the kingdom will be divided. Like iron mixed with clay, it will have some of the strength of iron, but while some parts of it will be strong, other parts will be as weak as clay. The mixture of iron and clay also shows that these kingdoms will try to strengthen themselves by forming alliances with one another through intermarriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron and clay do not mix. Daniel talks about, in this interpretation, he talks about 4 great empires that changed the world. He talks about this first one when he addresses Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian Empire, the head of gold. Babylon was an empire from 606 to 539 BC. And Babylon at the time, at the height of the empire, really did rule what was pretty much the known world at that point in time throughout the Middle East, and what we would look at today on a modern map. We would see Saudi Arabia and Iraq and parts of Turkey. That was all part of the Babylonian Empire, even out into the Mediterranean Sea. Some of the island countries today, they were all part of Babylon. They forged great trade routes. They were adept at trading with other parts of the world like Asia, and so they went back and forth, and and traded along different various trade routes and different methods. But they were a powerful empire. And so Daniel says that's the head of gold. It's a head that has been crowned, he says, by the God of heaven with sovereignty, power, strength, and honor. And it's important that we remember that Daniel's not just saying that to be nice. God has revealed that to Daniel. He's revealed to Daniel this truth that he speaks, that the God of heaven, in verse 37, has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and honor. Now, this was a pagan man, a man who served all kinds of gods. He didn't know who God was. He had no idea who God was. He didn't know if God was a statue. He didn't know if God was a bird. He didn't know if God was a mountain. He didn't know if Daniel's God was God. He thought maybe they were all God. He had no idea who God was. But Daniel says to him, the God of heaven has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and honor. Now, that's important for us to remember. It's important for us to remember that God raises up kings, that God raises up rulers, that God raises them up and he sits them back down when he's done. That whatever happens on this earth politically or with kingdoms and power, happens because the God of heaven permits it. And God says that through Daniel to Nebuchadnezzar, that God has raised you up. Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 1 says that the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. It doesn't matter who the king is. The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. And sometimes we get so worked up about who's in charge and who's in power and what party's in charge and what party's in power. And we just need to remember this simple truth, that it doesn't matter who the king is. Their heart is in the hand of the Lord. He's calling the shots. He's got the ultimate say. And we can have positions, and we should have positions and opinions. We should stand up for what's right. We should exercise our rights to vote and do all that we can to influence the world that we live in. But at the end of the day, whether your horse wins or loses, it doesn't matter, because God is the one who has the final say and the final authority. Daniel says that God has raised you up, that God has given you sovereignty. That doesn't mean that God anointed Nebuchadnezzar. It doesn't mean that God approved of everything that he stood for. It doesn't mean that God looked at Nebuchadnezzar and said, well, there's the best I can find. I guess he's going to have to do. No, it just means that God saw Nebuchadnezzar and said, okay, I'm going to use this. He's not living for me. He doesn't understand me. He doesn't know me. But as long as he's here and as long as he's got some influence, as long as he's got an ability to rule and reign, I'm going to get involved and I'm going to use it. And that's exactly what God was doing through Nebuchadnezzar. And so the head of gold is Babylon. Then he says that there's going to come a time where your kingdom ends and there'll come another kingdom. And he describes this with a chest and arms of silver. And this is the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire, much like the Babylonian Empire, dwelled in almost relatively the same geographical area, 539 BC to 331 BC. They also established trade routes. They expanded those trade routes into other parts of Europe, further up into other parts of Asia as well, down even some into the northern parts of Africa. And this was an empire that was, as empires go in that day, they were a little less gory, I guess we would say, but still bloodthirsty, but not quite to the extent as some of the others. But this is the Medo-Persian Empire. It would be the next empire that would dominate the world scene. And then he talks about the empire that comes next after that the Medo-Persian Empire would fall. There would come another with the torso and thighs of bronze. He's talking about the Greek Empire. the Greek Empire of 331 to 146 BC, and they would expand further into Europe and dominate and control that part of the world, as well as the geographical region of Babylon and Medo-Persian. These empires just kept getting bigger and bigger in their influence. And then he says that there'll come a fourth empire with legs and feet of iron and clay. And that's referring to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire of 146 BC to 476 AD, or AD 476 is the proper way to say that. So this was the longest of the empires, the Roman Empire. So as Daniel reveals this interpretation of the dream, he is speaking prophetically to Nebuchadnezzar and all those who are listening. He's given a historical forecast. It's history that is laid out before Nebuchadnezzar, and this is what's going to happen, and this is what's going to take place. Now for us, we look at it and it's all historical. We look back on it because it's all already happened. And so we can see that, yes, these empires did exist, and yes, they had this time period in which they were thriving on the earth. And yes, one fell and another one came. We can look back and see that it's all historical. So it's not prophetic for us, but it was in the moment. In the moment that Daniel was speaking in, it was a prophecy to Nebuchadnezzar because it had not all yet happened. And so we look at this historical forecast, and we can go back and what does that teach us when we can do that? We learn, and we're reminded from that God's word is true. That if he says he's going to do something, or he says it's going to happen, then it's absolutely going to happen. In verse 35, Daniel says, I saw this rock. He also says in verses 44 and 45, I saw this rock, that during the reign of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never end, will never be destroyed or never be conquered. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness, and it will stand forever. That is the meaning of the rock cut from the mountain, though not by human hands, that crushed to pieces the statue of iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold. The great God was showing the king what will happen in the future. The dream is true, and its meaning is certain. Daniel says there's going to be these kingdoms on the earth. They'll be powerful. They'll be great. They'll have authority. They'll encompass a lot of people. And they'll bring to the world some good things, some technology and some inventions and some culture and learning and education. Those things all come out of these empires and out of these kingdoms. And there are some good things that came from these historical periods. But then Daniel says, at the end of it, God's going to raise up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. It'll never be conquered. It'll have no ending. This is a part of the vision that is yet prophetic for us today. It's historical, but yet it's still prophetic as well. During all this time, in the middle of these kingdoms rising and falling, it says that God will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. And that kingdom comes in the middle of this kingdom of iron and clay, having its field day on the earth, and that's Christ, who's born in the time of the Roman Empire, who comes to the earth under Roman rule and authority and lives under that Roman rule and authority his entire life, but yet he still preaches and teaches and heals and sets free and delivers, and God works through him, and he goes about all the world teaching and preaching, the world of his world, teaching and preaching and proclaiming that there is there is a kingdom coming, and I'm building a kingdom. He goes to a cross and he dies. He comes back to life again. He sets his message and his word, and his followers, they go throughout the whole world and they preach and they teach Jesus Christ and the coming kingdom. And there is growth of the church. God was building this kingdom inside of another kingdom. He was initiating what was happening. All the while, the Roman Empire is struggling to stay on its feet. So Daniel gives this forecast of what is yet to come. And he says to the king, this is the dream. This is what you had. And its meaning is certain. Look at the response in verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar threw himself down before Daniel and worshipped him. And he commanded his people to offer sacrifices and burn sweet incense before him. Now here's a man who Daniel's just said, the God of heaven has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and honor. He didn't say anything about wisdom. He didn't say anything about smarts. Here's a man who God has given the ability to do all these things, and here he is confused again. He thinks Daniel's God. So let's bow down and worship him. Let's burn incense before him. Let's do all these things. And he says to Daniel, truly your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over lords, the revealer of mysteries. For you have been able to reveal this secret. Now that's a fascinating statement that a pagan king makes. He says, truly your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings, the revealer of secrets and mysteries. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't remove all the gods out of the equation. He doesn't renounce all the other gods. He doesn't say, your God is the only God. I'm going to serve your God and your God alone. We're going to set this kingdom right, and we're going to make sure that we serve your God. He doesn't do that. He says, your God is the greatest of all gods. He doesn't renounce the others. He tries to add another one to his bag of gods. He says, I think I'll just add him into the mix. We'll keep the gods of the moon and the gods of the stars and the gods of this rock over here, but we'll add yours to the mix, and he'll be the greatest of all. And we know that God doesn't share his glory with any other. It was a classic case of missing the point. He completely missed the point. Nebuchadnezzar heard this great proclamation. He heard what Daniel had to say. He saw the work of God right in front of Daniel. He saw God moving in Daniel's eyes, and yet he misses the point. He says, your God is the greatest of all the gods, but I still got all my gods. They're still all in my bag over here, and when I need to pull a god out of a hat, I'll find one, and maybe yours will be the one that I pull out first. He missed the point. But yet, God favors him. God favors Daniel and his friends. Then God appointed Daniel to a high position, or then the king appointed Daniel to a high position and gave him many valuable gifts. He made Daniel ruler over the whole province of Babylon, as well as the chief over all his wise men. At Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be in charge of all the affairs of the province of Babylon, while Daniel remained in the king's court. God used Daniel to reveal all of this to the king, to tell him what's going to happen in the future, to give him this forecast of future events, this forecast of history as we look back on it now. God did all of that, and it appeased the anger of the king. It silenced his threats. It taught him things. It showed him things about God. It caused him to have respect for Daniel as a man of God, and for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as men of God. All of those things happened. But the greatest thing that happened in this story is that God favored Daniel and his friends all the more. This wasn't about the king learning all of this stuff. This wasn't about the king stopping his threats. It wasn't about bringing peace to a situation. It was about God elevating Daniel. It was about God doing something in Daniel's life, developing him to be the leader that he wanted him to be, putting him in a position where he could use him in a greater way. Now, you can look back on this story and you can think, well, it seems kind of like maybe God was blessing Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe God was bringing some kind of a blessing because Nebuchadnezzar had this big problem. He didn't know what to do. He was going to kill everybody. He was going to make this grave mistake. And it kind of looks like God stepped in and helped Nebuchadnezzar. But we get to the end and we find out that it wasn't about Nebuchadnezzar at all. It was about God using Daniel and his friends. It was about God putting them in a place where he could use them more. And if it meant that he had to help Nebuchadnezzar in the process, then that's okay. And I want to tell you that God will use any situation and any person. And he wants to elevate you. He wants to bless you and me. He wants to favor us. And sometimes in favoring us, the favor of God coming through us, it does have a blessing in other people's lives. We need to allow that to happen. Daniel didn't try to stop that from happening. He didn't try to squash that. He allowed it to happen because he knew that every time God worked in his life, every opportunity that he could to let God work through him was an opportunity that maybe somebody else who was standing by, maybe somebody else who was just watching would figure out, I need to serve that God. I need to serve him. And so Daniel allowed it to happen. But all the while, God is elevating Daniel and his friends, putting them in places where they can be of influence. God does that for us as his children. And remember, it all started back in chapter 1, where Daniel purposed in his heart, I'm going to do it God's way. I'm going to live for the Lord. Let's stand together tonight. Let's pray together before we leave. Father, I come to you again and I just thank you for our time tonight. We thank you for this beautiful chapter in Daniel's life, that we see your favor weaving in and out of his life and in and out of this story. We see the wisdom of God at work. We see the enablement of God at work. We see the favor of God resting upon a man who chose for his life that he would live differently. We see, God, how you raise up kings and leaders and how you sit kings and kingdoms down. And we see in this beautiful chapter the future hope that you give to all of us, that there's coming a kingdom that will never end, that will cover the earth, and one that doesn't come from human hands, it comes from you. And God, all of that we learn in this chapter tonight, and we see it. We see a picture of your work and what you want to do in our lives. And I just pray for every person here. Maybe there's somebody here tonight who is feeling like they can't be used by you. Maybe there's someone here who feels like they have no influence, or someone here tonight who feels like they've walked away from your favor. And I just pray tonight that you would help us to realize that that's not true, that you want to favor us, you want to use us, that there is something that you have for us to do, that we're here by design and on purpose and for a reason. And I pray, God, that we would dig in and that we would find what that purpose is and live it out with all of our hearts. Use us, God. Favor us. Give us the ability to be in the right places at the right time so that we can speak your great name to someone else. Lord, I just pray that we would meditate on this as we leave and let it continue to challenge us and continue to grow with us as we go. Father, I just pray now that you would just go with us tonight, be with us, protect us, keep us in all of our ways. Bring us back Sunday ready to worship you and to give you our very best. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.